Welcome, everybody. This is Dan Levinson, and I am about to be joined by B'nai Lappi and our guest for today here on the Oral Talmud, Professor David Kraemer from the Jewish Theological Seminary. We're really excited to welcome you today to this episode of the Oral Talmud, our show where B'nai and I are exploring various parts of the Talmud that we find most intriguing and most important for our times. And we've been promising you a structure in which every other week B'nai and I will be studying a piece of Talmud and talking about it. And on the alternating weeks, we'll be in conversation with somebody who knows a lot more than we do. And today we're really super excited to have that be our first one, which is B'nai's Talmud teacher, David Kraemer. So let me just give a few words of introduction. He is the Joseph J. and Dora Abel Librarian and Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. By the way, I would note that I'm friends with Joseph Abel's granddaughter, so that's a very exciting thing for me to see. And he is also the director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And among his many writings and accomplishments, he has recently published a book called A History of the Talmud, published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. B'nai is holding it up there. And as I understand it, that in addition to all that, your real passion as a scholar is the history of Jews and eating, the Jews and food, and a lot of your writing has been about that topic, which I'm excited to talk to you about, I think at a different time on Judaism Unbound maybe. But let's jump into this. We're so excited to have you, Professor Kraemer, to talk about the history of the Talmud. And I guess that, first of all, I just want to welcome you. I just want listeners to hear your voice.
Thank you.
So it's great to have you. And I thought we could just get started by you're giving us a little bit of a sense of, we have been here for 3 weeks talking about some of what's in the Talmud, but it would be great to do, what if we hadn't done that? Could you start by giving us a little bit of grounding about the story of how the Talmud came to be and who wrote it?
Would that we knew.
And what do you think it's trying to do?
Oh, okay.
What's its project?
That's a question that I can spend a little bit more time on. Who wrote it is a very difficult question. Let me step back to the history of it. For those of you listening, let me just say that I will use the term Talmud and Gemara interchangeably. So, for those of you who think of Talmud as Mishnah and Gemara together, please know that I use the term Talmud as a synonym for the term Gemara. The Talmud emerges obviously from a very, very long history of development. It is built upon the foundation that is the Mishnah, which itself is a document that went through generations of development following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. We know that the rabbis were a very, very small group. They actually continued to be a very small group, not only during the period of the Mishnah, leading to about the year 200-ish of the Common Era, but rabbis both in the land of Israel and in Babylon continued to be a very small group with little but increasing influence over the course of the next many centuries. So on one level, we have access in this material to the musings and approaches of a group that wanted to take responsibility, but did not yet have responsibility. And it's possible that this actually gave them a great deal of freedom because some of the unexpected quality of the Talmud, its boldness, may be a product of the fact that these were people who had less to risk, at least in the short term. But going back, this was a group who, like other Jews, had to figure out what it meant to live in a world where what had been central before their own period, that is to say the temple, sacrifice, and there's no doubt that this was a central part of it what it meant to be a Jew during that prior period, what does it mean now to live beyond? In the first iteration of that, in the Mishnah, they took an interesting approach. On the one hand, they offered a focus in the structure of the Mishnah and in the way it expressed its law that was deceptive, because even though the Mishnah came to shape 130 years or so after the destruction of the temple, it actually devoted a lot of attention to the temple, to its service, when it spoke about the Mishnah, when it spoke about Pesach, Passover, or when it spoke about Sukkot. It really focused more than anything else on the way these holidays were observed in the temple. But then with the Mishnah, the sages who composed the Talmuds, and particularly the Babylonian Talmud, which of course is what we mean when we say the Talmud, they were far more comfortable in leaving behind, historically speaking, what was obviously not going to be recovered soon. And when they spoke about temple, they spoke on a level of theory. For them, this was an expression of God's command, of God's will, and that was independent of the physical reality. So that was their approach to the temple. And then when they looked toward the rest of Jewish life, they laid out bold new paths. Jewish life could take place in Babylon, meaning anywhere. It didn't rely upon life in the land of Israel at all, because the only thing that was tied to the land of Israel irreversibly was temple and a certain sequence of agricultural laws. And again, those could be pure theory, because what mattered about our relationship with God was the study of Torah. And Torah could be studied whether or not what the Torah described actually existed in reality. And so for Jews who were not part of the rabbinic elite, what the rabbis laid out in the Talmud was a series of practices and new directions that would make Jewish life not only viable, but vibrant in the coming generations. And for those who could affiliate with the elite, who had the time and inclination to engage in the study of Torah, now meaning not Torah in the old sense, but Torah in the new rabbinic sense, this meant that the exploration of God's will could take place anywhere. And this was an important engine of what Judaism would be for generations. I know I'm speaking more on myself now, I realize, on the level of theory than the generation by generation history. But to me, that's what matters most.
Yeah, well, let's start. Let's go all the way back, and I'm curious if what you can tell us about who the early rabbis of the pre-Mishnah period, right after the destruction of the temple, who were these people? I guess my question is, were they people who were kind of dissidents before that, when the temple was there? Were they kind of people like in our time, we might think of the people that are, doing earth-based Judaism, or whatever, they're out there, they're really serious about Judaism, but they're doing something profoundly new and different from or maybe not new, but different from what is going on, let's say, in a synagogue. And were there people out there who are kind of like, when the temple was destroyed, they were like, oh, I'm really sad about it, but the truth of the matter was, I didn't really like that kind of Judaism anyway. Versus, or were they kind of priests, who are kind of like, well, we're thrown out of our temple now, so we can't do that anymore. So I guess we have to come up with something new. What do we know about those early rabbis?
Well, I mean, we have to divide it into two periods, because immediately after the destruction of the temple, I think it's fair to say that most people who would be called rabbis, and there were very few of them, as I said, along with most Jews living certainly in the land of Israel, beyond as well, I suspect, hoped that the temple would be rebuilt. And they had a model for this, a historical but also a sacred model. The historical sacred model was the fact that this was not the first destruction. The temple had been destroyed before. And with the realization of the promise of the prophets, which remarkably came to fruition within 70 years, the first temple was Well, I mean, it wasn't completely rebuilt. The altar was rededicated. So there was the renewal of the sacrificial service in Jerusalem. And at the same time, Jews were able to return, not all Jews, to be sure, but the Jews who wanted were able to return from the Babylonian exile. And so the patterns of history that the prophets used to explain the destruction and predicted the recovery actually came to be. So in light of the fact that all of this became sacred scripture, sacred history, when the Second Temple was destroyed, I have no doubt that most Jews looked to the Tanakh, to the several books that were themselves echoes of the first destruction, and said, oh, this promises that if it happened once, it can happen again. And so it's no surprise that in the 7th decade from the destruction of the temple by the Romans, you've got, this is the 130s of the Common Era, you've got the emergence of a new Jewish revolt under the leadership of Bar Kokhba. According even to rabbinic reports, there were rabbis who believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and so he should have been, because that would have been a fulfillment of the prophetic, the Tanakhic promise of restoration in the 7th decade after 70 years. But now, when that revolt failed, when Rome prevailed, then they knew for sure that they were living in a new world. And so, did they see themselves as dissidents? No, I think they probably saw themselves as responding to a need which had no room for an alternative, meaning the temple would not be rebuilt. You couldn't go back to that. So you had to decide what would come next. For Jews whose only alternative was the rebuilding of the temple, they had no future. That was the reality. Interestingly, if the rabbis had a dissident sense, it may show up in the evidence we have in the Mishnah and other early rabbinic teachings in connection to their tension with the priests. There's no doubt that the rabbis experienced a tension with the priests, and they made a claim that they were the legitimate heirs, even of the priestly tradition. They knew that priests could be the only ones to serve in a rebuilt temple, but the experts of the service in the temple would be sages, would be rabbis. But what they had was imagination and boldness. What's remarkable about it is, if we look at the Mishnah and its balance, they were deeply rooted in the inherited tradition. But rather than holding them back, it actually allowed them to go forward. For people who are deeply rooted, and I think this is true more generally, it's people who feel tenuous, who are afraid to look in new directions, and people who are confident with what they've inherited, who are more likely to be bold going forward. Now, we could discuss how that works out in our own world. There are other challenges, but I'm actually willing to stand by that claim.
Dan, this reminds me of your knowledge chutzpah curve.
Yeah, on our Judaism Unbound podcast, we've played around with this idea of the knowledge versus chutzpah curve, which is kind of a U-shaped curve. And it suggests that the people who have the least knowledge and the people who have the most knowledge are potentially the most creative. Whereas there's a place in the middle where if you have a certain amount of knowledge, you think that we're not allowed to do it this way. Whereas if you learn more and more and more, you realize, oh, that's the story that we tell, that we're not allowed to do it this way, but actually we can do it this way because there's a precedent that only, I knew about, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I would have to think about the first part of your curve. We could discuss it, but the latter part of your curve, there's no doubt that it's true. That, the more you know, the more you have access to the tradition, the more you can take advantage of. And this gives you the confidence to go forward more boldly if that's what conditions call for.
Mm-hmm.
So David, take us further from 135 to the creation of the Talmud, and how that's different from what the project of the Mishnah was.
Okay, well, of course, the Mishnah is also after 135. So the Mishnah is the first product responding
Yeah,
to
thank
the, to the crisis of 135.
you.
And, its balance and rootedness is what I just described. Again, it's important for us to bear in mind that the rabbis who produced the Mishnah, if you were to ask a Jew on the street of Sepphoris in the Galilee, even Sepphoris, where there were rabbis, we know there were rabbis in Sepphoris, let alone in other towns. What do you think of the rabbis and their work, this product, the Mishnah? They would have looked at you and say, what are you talking about? I've never heard of, I know that rabbi means a master, or as a generic term, it would have been known, but as a specific group of people, it would have been unknown to most Jews. And their Mishnah certainly would not have been known. There's no evidence of anyone outside of rabbis knowing Mishnah till centuries later. So, that's if we're focusing on 200. What happens then? Now we've got something really interesting. And this comes back to your curve, I think, because you've got the development of a rabbinic movement, both in the land of Israel and in Babylonian. Both of those movements produce things that we call Talmuds, right? So 3rd century, 4th century rabbinic groups in Palestine and in Babylonia focus on this Mishnah, and they interpret it, and they add their own teachings. What's interesting, though, is the contrast, because when you look at the Yerushalmi, the so-called Jerusalem Talmud or Palestinian Talmud, that is a much more reserved, I would say, conservative document, reflecting a more conservative agenda. I feel something fearful in the Palestinian rabbinic community. They're not comfortable with doing or saying things with more chutzpah. So, where I first saw this really in some depth is work that I did a number of years ago on responses to human suffering in classical rabbinic teachings. I wrote a book on that. And in the Yerushalmi, there's always a warning. You can't express protests about human suffering and still be pious as far as the rabbinic teachers of the Talmud Yerushalmi are concerned. You have to be accepting, you have to be affirming. Of course, God is just. At the same time, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, the Babylonian sages are thoroughly open to the legitimacy of expressing protest, of expressing complaint. They affirm the positions of whether it's Job or Ecclesiastes, biblically speaking. I remember one thing I found, this was just remarkable to me. There is a phrase which some listening, you folks certainly will know, in the suffering of Rabbi Akiva when he's being in the stories, when he's being tortured, leading to his death by the Romans, and those observing, whether it be an angel or it be his disciples, say, Zot Torah v'zos chara. Rabbi Akiva, the great teacher of Torah, this is Torah and this is its reward. In the Yerushalmi, that phrase is attributed to the arch apostate, Elisha ben Abuya. If you say that in the Yerushalmi, you're an apostate.
Wow.
Right? In the Bavli, you can be Moses and say that. That's the amazing thing. So it's a very different story. In the Bavli in general, they're willing to experiment, theologically, intellectually, in ways that the Yerushalmi is not willing to do. The Yerushalmi wants to arrive at answers. And the Babylonian Talmud doesn't want to arrive at answers. When it begins with two opinions, it prefers to end with two opinions, because even if the opinions are diametrically opposite, the Babylonian Talmud believes that there's wisdom in all sides of serious Torah. And if there's wisdom in all sides of serious Torah, then even if in practice you have to make a decision, when you're engaged in the exploration of Torah, it's worth exploring all possibilities.
Mm-hmm. 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 Sort of embodying the Rabbi Meir.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you get to, the Talmudic period itself. We've got, of course, the most prevalent voice in the Talmud, in the Bavli, is the anonymous voice, which some people call the Stam or the Stama. But one of the most prominent voices, certainly the most prominent named voice, is that of Rava, who was a early first half of 4th century Amora, rabbinic teacher, and his teachings are just extraordinary. The challenge, the questioning, he offered a model of interest in exploration for exploration's sake that predicts the broad approach of the Talmud as a whole. Unfortunately, we can't know beyond the voice what may have happened in order to establish the stage for that. We know very little about the specifics. We know a lot, actually, about the specifics of the progress of Palestinian history and therefore Jews in Palestine over the course of these centuries. We know very little about the history of Jews in Babylon during this period. We have general directions in Babylonian history, and we can assume Jews within it. We have almost no evidence of any hardship or persecution of Jews. They're isolated stories, but most scholars believe that they are genuinely isolated. And if anything, and I would stand by this thesis, I believe that what made the Bavli possible in the end was not Jewish hardship, but Jewish comfort. That by the 6th century, by the 500s, when the Talmud came to something approaching its final formation, other additional work remained to be done even after, but we can speak of a Talmud in the 6th century. At that point, Babylonian Empire was actually an empire at peace with a imperial structure that was reconstituted and improved and peaceful over the course of decades. And Jews were able to take advantage of that. What's remarkable about it is they produced this document which would function both for Jews living at peace and comfort in future diasporas, but also for Jews living in hardship. It was sufficiently abundant and open that it could serve Jews whatever the conditions in which they found themselves.
Oh, you're still muted.
Is there any way to know what the process was of bringing the Talmud into its final form, in the sense of even how long it took? Because, for example, we have this daily Talmud page study thing called Daf Yomi, which takes 7.5 years to study, the page in a very cursory manner, 1 page a day. So in a way, it feels like it's the work of more than one lifetime to even be able to do the kind of final redaction. And I'm wondering if that's the case, and if so, how do we're not even talking about sort of multiple authorship the way we talk about the Torah, where there are these multiple documents that get put together, but multiple authorship in the sense that more like that it's the project of one person and maybe he dies and then his students take over, and how did that process happen? But if there's more than one person involved, then potentially there's more than one agenda going on. And I'm wondering if we think about even what we call the stama, the final redactor of the Talmud, or more or less final, is there a single agenda there? Is there a way to tell?
That's a very good question, and an answer is not easy. We have to divide the question into 2 halves. The first is the Amoraic development of the material that would come to be included in the final Talmud, and then the anonymous voice, which really defines the Talmud as a whole. And we have no access to the Amoraic voice except through the context and therefore the lens of the anonymous voice. There's no doubt, and whenever I use the phrase, there is no doubt, you can understand that to mean there's relatively little doubt. So it's a slight overstatement. But few people doubt that the Amoraic period, the Amoraic tradition, was a creation over the course of generations, obviously, a 3rd, 4th century into the 5th century, that involved multiple voices, the disciples, the memorizers. This was an oral tradition where a teaching of a master would be repeated by disciples and memorizers, formal professional memorizers. And so the tradition led to accretions over the course of one generation and then another and then another. And this came to the 5th and then the 6th century, and the people who created the final Talmud certainly had this vast body of material with which to work. It has to be said that we know a lot about oral traditions. There's been a very voluminous scholarship on oral cultures and the way traditions survive or transmitted, change over the course of time. And this needs to be said very definitively. Oral traditions, or oral preservation and transmission of traditions, changes what is being memorized, preserved, and transmitted. And those changes are unknown to the people who are making the changes. This is crucial. When scholars speak about the way the rabbinic, this transmission changed earlier teachings over the course of time, it's not because the subsequent generations said, you know what, I don't like that, or I'm going to change it to the way I prefer it in any kind of conscious way. But when people memorize and then repeat over and over again, it's unambiguous that even when they say that in repeated recitations of a teaching, they've repeated it in exactly the same fashion, recordings show that that's not true. That change just happens, and it certainly happens over the course of generations. We can see from a careful examination of traditions that the changes typically reflect the assumption and prejudices of the people doing the repeating, even when they're unaware of it. And so when we compare the same story in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, and there are always differences. The stories are never, and here I mean literally, never identical. When we compare them, we can see that there's certain ideological motivations that inform the final version we have in each of the two Talmuds. But that doesn't mean that the people who repeated the stories those ways knew they were doing this. All of this was unconscious as they repeated and the story changed. And again, they didn't even recognize the change. What this means is that when we get to, say, the year 500, when we get to the early 6th century, you've got this vast tradition, which in certain respects was an original tradition, meaning there really were teachers named Rav and Shmuel and Abaye and Rava, and they really taught things that were to one extent or another expressed in the traditions attributed to them, but we can never know the percentages, right? We don't know whether a tradition repeated in the year 500 of Shmuel from 250, is it 50% accurate to what Shmuel said? Is it 80%? Is it 95%? And by the way, I wouldn't even suggest there's a general number. We just know that traditions change. And so as a scholar, my response to that is to say, I know there's a foundation here, but I don't know what it is. I've got to be careful in using all of those traditions, because one thing I know for sure is that there were changes. So then you get to the early 6th century, and Babylonian rabbinic sages, we don't know how many of them there were. We don't know how long it took for them to do this. But during that time, there was a group of these sages who said, we've got to put this material into a particular form. It represented their approach. This doesn't represent rabbinic assumptions or ideologies of the 3rd century. It may represent assumptions and ideologies that had their roots in the 4th century and beyond. There's no doubt that these things develop, but the full-blown picture that we call the Talmud is the product of the 5th century. 500, 6th century. And the only thing we can say for certain is that everything came through the lens of that final product. And so you've got an opinion of Abai and an opinion of Rava, and they're in opposition to one another. And the comparison of their views ultimately comes through the anonymous voice. The challenge of the assumptions of Abaye, the defenses of Abaye, and then the challenges of Rava, the defenses of Rava going back to challenges of Abaye, all of that comes through the anonymous voice. So, when I speak about the Talmud and what the Talmud says, I'm always referring to the final product. By final product, I have to be careful here, because I don't mean with all of the technical vocabulary, the precise wording of this. There's no doubt that continued to develop into the 7th and even the 8th century. There's very important work that shows that the precise formulations was actually the work of reception, and the reception and even the final authority of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, is the product of the Babylonian Geonim, not the Talmudic sages, but in this case, the rabbinic sages residing in Iraq and nearby lands in the context of early Islam. During that period, some of the technical vocabulary was added to the Talmud, but it was essentially a finished product already in the 6th century. I hope that answers your question, and maybe a lot more. So tell me what else I need to respond to make this clear.
So my brain is exploding with so much joy and questions I want to ask, but I don't want to step on you, Dan. Was there something that you wanted to ask right now?
No, go ahead, B'nai. This is your area.
Okay, so David, I wonder if you could talk about who you think the intended audience was. Who did the Stama have in mind as who was going to be learning this? Dan and I have been in conversation for years, as I have been with my fellow teachers and students, over whether there are 2 audiences. The way Menachem Fish talks about, the Talmud speaking to 2 audiences, and it's winking to one, and it's kind of using the language that the other is going to be able to hold on to, but it's really telescoping a much more radical project than it seems to. But maybe it's just one of its intentions is to make sure everyone comes along. Or is it really just speaking to those, the Hamevin Yavins, those who really get what's going on and are really learning a technique for marketing radical change? I don't know. What do you think? Is there one audience? Are there 2?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny the way you express it, because to me, it's obvious that, first of all, it's obvious that there's actually one audience, whatever happened to it later on. And it's also obvious that it's a radical project, right? The reason it's not obvious to many that it's a radical project is because they're reading it through later lenses, right? So the way we see anything, obviously, is informed by the way we're taught to see it. What I try to do, or what I've tried to do in my examination of Talmud, is to get rid of as many of those later lenses as possible and take the Talmud as much as I can at face value. So let me begin by responding to questions. I've already given the short answer, which is it's obvious that it's a radical project and it's obvious that it's one audience.
And can you flesh out what that radical project is
yeah,
for? Okay.
I definitely will. So
Okay.
to specify the audience, the way I've characterized the Talmud and therefore its audience is that the Talmud is intended to be, it's the equivalent of a curriculum for a postgraduate theory seminar at an elite law school.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I've chosen that characterization carefully because this means that the vast majority of people training to be lawyers won't be interested in this. More importantly, they won't be capable of really understanding it, right? So again, postgraduate theory seminar in an elite law school.
Yeah.
Right? Now back to the Talmud, and to begin again to answer your question by reference to what we know through the sociology of knowledge. And this is really crucial. A lot of people who have tried to answer this question have failed to account for what we know about knowledge and literacy in the ancient world. Because, you know, even where there were written documents, manuscripts, right? There wouldn't be printed works for many, many centuries. They were very few, which meant that most people, and this includes Jews who prided ourselves on literacy, had at best very basic literacy. It also means, by the way, that to be educated and to be literate are not the same thing. We equate literacy and education. For them, that wasn't the case. You could be relatively well educated, actually, by, for example, hearing the Torah read in synagogue, but still not know how to read very well, let alone to write. There were people who knew how, you know, who could kind of decode writing without knowing how to, without knowing how to write themselves. But then, if access to any knowledge is either through the rare written medium or through a rare oral medium. I mean, think about it. Who is teaching Talmud or its related tradition in order that you could learn it if there were almost no written documents, right? The answer was, it was a rabbinic master. The rabbinic master needed to admit you to his circle. That meant that he had to know you first, right? There was no remote learning. It was all very intimate. And if you weren't the kind of person that he wanted as a disciple, you weren't going to make your way in. And so, you know, we've got evidence of some gatherings of rabbinic disciples, but we're talking about hundreds of people, not more. And those were only occasional gatherings. What all this means is that the Talmud is an elite document speaking to an elite few. It's an insider's document. And this is very important. It doesn't mean that the elite wants the lessons of the document to remain elite, but it means that this approach is an elite approach. So let me suggest an analogy. Corporations produce glossy annual reports for shareholders, right? And they've got really pretty pictures, and they offer the best representation of the bottom line and all of that. But we all know that behind closed doors, right, when the executive committee of the board and the upper echelons of the management meet, they're sharing things that aren't so pretty, right? They're willing to experiment with ideas, to admit flaws, to offer critiques that they're not going to make public, right? And I think the Talmud does the same thing. The Talmud is the rabbis sharing amongst themselves possibilities that I believe they would hesitate to share outside, right? So to take something very basic, B'nai, you know that I believe that the rabbis behind the Talmud believe that they do not know the truth, where truth means what God actually wants of us. They recognize that as human beings, our access to the divine is limited by its nature. It's imperfect, it's flawed. And so the best you can do is explore God's will in our imperfection. And that actually has radical implications. Does that mean that the rabbis would have gone about on the street, let alone in the synagogue, and said, you know what, we actually don't know what God wants of us, and all we're doing in the halacha that we describe is the imperfect best we can do? Would they have admitted that? I suspect they wouldn't have admitted it, all that widely. So, that's what I mean when I say that this is an insider communication. And again, I have personally no doubt that that was the case. What happened in later generations is that for a variety of reasons, the Talmud became more and more popular. It became more popular, firstly, because it became more and more authoritative. Right? And so people wanted access to this authoritative document. Interestingly, Maimonides, who was about the most elitist of the elite, and also pretty condescending when he allowed himself to be honest, and he was honest more often than not, says that the Talmud study is not something for most rabbis even. This isn't a general curriculum. He thought it was ridiculous for common rabbis who in his estimation weren't all that smart, to study Talmud. Talmud is something for a very, very elite audience. But later on, what happened? I mean, first of all, the Ashkenaz had a different opinion of this. Opinions both in Ashkenaz and elsewhere changed when it became possible to actually get your hands on Talmud. We know that only one full manuscript of the Talmud survives the Middle Ages. Only one, right?
Wow.
The Munich manuscripts. Now, part of the explanation for that is that Talmuds were destroyed. Talmuds were burned. That's part of the history of this. But it is also a reflection of the fact that in the manuscript age, how many Talmuds could there be, right? So both of those explain what we see in terms of survival. This changed, of course, with the advent of the printing press, right? Movable type print changed everything. One of the first works that were printed for Jews was the Talmud, early in the 16th century. All of a sudden, rather than having a handful of copies, you could have dozens of copies or hundreds of copies in sizable Jewish communities. And as the economies and technologies of printing improved, technologies leading to improvements of economies, you had more and more Talmuds that circulated. And of course, that meant that people could get their hands on it, could study it. They could study it with the aid of these great teachers we know of as Rashi, for example. Think about it. Before the printing press, Rashi wasn't on the page of the Talmud. Right? If you wanted Rashi as a teacher, you needed a separate manuscript. Right? But along comes printing, and Rashi, the great, great teacher of Talmud, is right there on the page. And that leads to popularization. We come into later centuries. You've got translations into vernacular languages of the Talmud in the 19th and the 20th century. And then in an age like ours, you've got electronic versions that are accessible to all. It's broken up into paragraphs followed by translation. Anybody who wants can pretend to study Talmud, even though you and I, as teachers of Talmud, know that, you can't really study Talmud without at least a preliminary teacher. I remember well, my first attempt to study Talmud. I was in high school. I did not grow up with this. And at that time, there was a project to create a Talmud that would help students enter the world of Talmud. Wasn't merely a translation, it was an explanation. It was actually a product of the institution where I work, the Jewish Theological Seminary. It was called Talmud La'am. And it was a ridiculous project. It failed. It failed before too long because, you can't do this. It just doesn't work. You need help. Even Steinsaltz, you need help to begin. After you've begun, then you can use these tools.
Right.
You can. But you need the help to begin.
Can I ask you just a clarification to what you were saying earlier about the one audience and the elite? Like, so very specifically, in the last couple of weeks, B'nai and I have been studying two particular stories. One, the story of where the mountain is held above the people, and the other is the famous Tanur Shalachnai story. In both cases, there is a quite obvious misquotation of the Tanakh, of the Bible, that is playing a fundamental role in the interpretation of the story. And what we talked about was the idea that basically anybody who could read this in a significant way, meaning like not just decoding the letters, but anybody who actually had the capacity to read this and understand what was going on, would also have the capacity to read the Tanakh and probably would know it very well. And this misquotation would be obvious to them, or at least pretty obvious to them if they looked at it. And I guess the question is that, first of all, what's your hypothesis about what's going on in the mind of the people who are doing this? And when you say that it's what the lessons are meant for the people, but not necessarily the study of Talmud, what is going on there where they're quite obviously misquoting? And so are they saying to other rabbis, hey, this is a little game that we can play, if we want the outcome to be a certain way? I mean, look, I went to law school. This is actually part of what you learn. I mean, not in the sort of disgusting way that I just put it, but in the way that kind of says, well, look, I mean, there's some gamesmanship going on here, and that's part of what it is to be a lawyer, is to learn how to do that. This is what you see the judges doing in the Supreme Court opinions, and that's part of the game, and that's why we have a bar exam.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. I would even go one step further. If the Talmud is an insider document, it means that the radical misreadings that you find both in those stories and in halachic discussions, they assumed that all the students of this knew the violence, the chutzpah that they were bringing to the reading of scripture. And anybody reading these rabbinic readings on the inside, I mean, basically the masters were saying to the disciples, we're going to do some pretty bold stuff here, and if you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to find the exit. So I think that is exactly right. It's actually interesting that you reference lawyers and the Supreme Court, because I use this as an object lesson in the way vibrant legal traditions have to operate in order to survive. I'm extremely impatient with originalist doctrine, which I think is scandalously naive, not only because we actually can't know what the original formulators knew. I mean, it's naive to believe you could do that. But even if you believe you can, a legal tradition dies if you insist that it remained confined by the original intent. Rabbinic tradition is the best example of this. Jewish legal tradition has survived through the ages vibrantly, precisely because it has been so bold in its rereadings of whatever God, whose intent we'll never know, may or may not have intended. I applaud the fact that the rabbis are comfortable with those aggressive rereadings, and I think that is what made the survival of Jewish life possible.
So can I float another one of our little theories past you and see what you have to say about it? Because one of the things that we said that by the way, like, not that I want to put B'nai on the spot here, but B'nai often will say, like, she's drawing this from you. So let's see if this is true.
Hopefully, I'm getting it right.
Not directly, not like you said it, but that she's interpreting you. So let's see. Somebody, by the way, on Facebook here is commenting that it's wonderful to see multiple generations in conversation here. And I consider myself B'nai student, so we really got 3 generations here. So that's exciting. So
I consider myself to be B'nai student as well.
Oh my goodness.
So then it's a circle.
Oh my God. My heart is racing fast enough as it is. Please, David, don't push me over the edge. Okay.
So the thought that we're exploring and sort of the relevance of this to our time, I think that you've actually made it even maybe more radical than B'nai usually does, because you've said that this is what kind of the way that I interpret what you just said, this is what always should be happening in a legal system. But at least when we're in a time of upheaval, if we are in one now, it seems quite obviously we've been in one for the last 200 years, and maybe this current situation is an accelerant even more. But we were talking about the idea that if the rabbis, here we're talking particularly about the Tanur Shalachnai story, the Avin Avachnai, where the rabbis basically in the story are saying that even if we hear the voice of God telling us this is the way to do it, but we don't agree, that we don't listen to the voice of God. And what we were talking about was that if we take our initial axiom, which is that anybody who could read at that time could read everything and understood the implications, that there's inherently a message there to us to say that if a time should come where the outcome that we think is right from what B'nai calls svara, a really deep moral intuition, that what we think is right is not what the rules would indicate, that we have the potential to say to the person who is effectively the rabbinic version of the voice of God, which is the person pointing to the Shulchan Aruch and saying, I see it right here, the rule is right here, you're doing it wrong. And we would say, well, the rabbis said to God, follow the majority, in a misquotation, and we don't have to listen to the voice of God. And so by the what's the mathematical principle of where you say this A equals B, so B equals C, that we don't have to listen to the rabbis in that voice, and that the rabbi's response would be nitzchuli banai, right? That you got me, you're meaning I accept that argument. And so there's actually inherent in the Talmud itself the methodology to sort of undo the Talmud's approach if and when such a time should come. I'm curious how you respond to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right, but I mean, the but is that subsequent Talmudic societies, as it were, Talmudic cultures, including the traditional world in our own day, they've received the Talmud in a different way than the Talmud may have offered itself, right? I mean, there's the Talmud's approach, but then the Talmud was used for multiple things. I mean, I often say that if the Talmud were doing halacha, meaning deciding halacha, then the rabbis of the Middle Ages wouldn't have had a job, right? But what that also means is that the rabbis of the Middle Ages were not doing what the Talmud was doing. I mean, some commentators were approaching this, Tosfot, for example, who were interested in far more than halakha. And so there were certainly commentators who were interested in and actually replicated the Talmudic approach. Latter day students of the Talmud, not so much. First of all, many in the traditional world are simply interested in what's the halacha, and through the numbers of the generations who they see as having a unified voice, ultimately, the authority is with the final decision, and you're not going to open that back up. There are also reports of the most brilliant teachers in traditional communities who have refused to do halacha because they realize that this kind of exploration, meaning what the Talmud actually models, is a bad model for halacha. So the halachic community may actually have fences against this. For them, the Talmud may not be the right model. Personally, my feeling is that the Talmud offers us a resource, whatever communities have done in between. The Talmud is a resource for possibilities precisely when the age is changing. When we need to respect and learn from the wisdom of the tradition we inherit, but where we can't accept it in its final packaged details, as it were. Dan, I mean, the way you expressed your question, it reminded me of, and B'nai, this goes to, kind of the ethical intuition of Svara. This goes to a text that I think is a very important model for us. It's in the last chapter of Tractate Yoma, we find the law of pikuach nefesh, of the obligation to save life, and how saving life comes before the restrictions of the Sabbath or Yom Kippur, other holy days. And the Mishnah states the principle pretty flat out, that where there's a doubt regarding survival of the life, saving that life takes priority. But then the Talmud does something terribly interesting. And what's interesting about it is it exposes the radicality of what the rabbis did. The Mishnah says, you save a life. The Talmud then says, how do we know that you're supposed to save a life? And it lines up the opinions of several rabbis and their proof texts from the Torah. You've got Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva and so forth, and they each give their proofs. And then along comes Rav, an Amora, not a Tana, right? So we're no longer in the Mishnaic period. And he says, my proof of pikuach nefesh, of the priority of saving, is better than all of yours, right? And he gives his proof, which is v'chai b'hem, right? You should live by them and not die by them. Then along comes Rava, and Rava says, all of the other ones can be easily refuted, except for Rav's. So what Rava is saying is that the Mishnah gave us the law before it had a justification for the law. The law was you save a life. Before they knew the Torah would support it, they said, of course, saving life comes first, because that's what their ethical intuition told them. If we look to earlier Jewish tradition, by the way, it's not obvious that saving a life comes first, right? Through the ages, to religious traditions, it's not obvious that saving a life comes first. So when the rabbis did it, they were doing something ethically radical, and the Talmud makes sure that we recognize that.
As far as students are learning that very passage right now.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I have so many questions. One, and we're not going to have time, but one of which is I'm fascinated by what I think you said earlier or suggested earlier, which is there's something about the popularization of access to this particular text, which actually is has a conserving force, rather than the opposite. And, one of Svara the Yeshiva's project is opening up the Talmud to particularly those on the margins, who have insights that I think the tradition needs, and have the chutzpah and the boldness to reenact the way of moving through the world that I think the Talmud advocates. And in this radical opening up of the Talmud that we're trying to do, now I'm thinking, are we inadvertently going to be creating a conservatizing effect? I don't know.
What's the conservative force? What did I
think you were saying that the Talmud, once the Talmud became authoritative, and then there's a printing press, and then lots more people than the originally intended audience began to learn it. They were learning it through a new lens and with a different intent, and using it for different reasons, and that sort of suffocated a bit its original goals and camouflaged its original or obvious radicalness.
So I think to some degree it did. I mean, both because by popularizing, by making study of Talmud broader, there were people engaged in it who didn't have the same kind of intellectual sophistication of earlier students. So I think that's true. I think it's also related to the fact that the society that supported Talmud study became, for a variety of reasons, more and more conservative. So it forced that upon many of the students, right? It was a kind of a feedback loop. I think the Talmud wants to bring in students who will read it from the margins, whatever that means. I mean, the irony of the printed Talmud, of course, is that it's about the expansion of the margins.
Yeah.
You know, regrettably, as you fill in the margins, there's less margin to find a place on. I'm just talking about the physical entity of the printed Talmud. But the Talmud wants new students with new insights always. But what the Talmud also models, and this is neither conservative, nor innovative, nor radical. Let's get rid of that dichotomy for the moment, okay? It's not an either or proposition. I mean, B'nai, I know you well enough to know that you want, you know, people to go back to the Talmud for its radical possibilities, precisely because it grounds them in the received tradition, right? Yeah. But it's a received tradition which has got all kinds of possibilities that earlier generations haven't fully recognized, right? So, you know, I remember earlier on when I began interpreting and writing about Talmud, and people would say to me, so, you know, if what you're saying is right, then how come people didn't see it before? How come it wasn't characterized this way before? And my response was, because I saw it. I mean, so, you know, I mean, you know, what difference does that make? And particularly, listen, people who begin from a different place have the possibility of insight that those who came before them didn't have. It's as simple as that. And since, as you've already heard, I don't believe in originalists, you know, I don't know what any particular meaning of the Talmud, I don't know what they would have thought. I can defend my interpretations, but in the end, it doesn't really matter, because what those who wrote the Talmud did was to create a document that made these possibilities. Yeah. They may not even have appreciated fully what they were doing. But
fantastic. Hi, everybody. So welcome to those who are new. Welcome to Nigun Seminar. For those returning, so good to see your faces again after our break. So just a couple of words on what we're doing here today. So this is just a little lunch break to have an opportunity to sing together even from afar. And I wanted to share some exciting updates. So many of you know that this is a new link. It's a new format for us. We're now on Jewish Live, and Hebrew College has picked up our Nigun Seminar as a project of Hebrew College. So the first thing I want to do is reintroduce myself. I'm Shani Rosenbaum. I'm a rabbinical student at Hebrew College and also the rabbinic intern at Temple Israel of Sharon, where this seminar originated. Some of you are joining us from there. And I wanted to introduce my colleague, Jackson Mercer, who's going to wave to you from his screen. He's got the cooler microphone than me. So Jackson is a colleague of mine at Hebrew College, and he's my new co-host for this seminar. So Jackson and I are going to be handing off the hosting every other week. This week, Jackson's taking care of the tech for us, so to make sure our sound and our streaming are working well, and to chat you cute things in the chat box. Well, I don't pay attention to that. And next week I'll be doing the back end stuff, and Jackson will be hosting up front. So excited to have you. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest teacher for this Nigun seminar. Rabbi Nehemiah Polin is a faculty member at Hebrew College, where Jackson and I both study. He's a beloved teacher of both of us. And he is going to teach us Nigun today and a little bit of Torah that goes with it. So I'm going to hand it over. And so a couple technical things before I hand it over to Nehemiah to teach us. So those of you who have joined us before will remember that until the very end when we stop our recording, all of you are going to be on mute, and Nehemiah and I will be the only voices heard. When Nehemiah teaches me the nigun, I'm going to sing back and you will sing with me. So you're learning along with me. I am your voice. But if you can keep your videos on, if you're comfortable with that, it's so nice to be able to see your faces singing with me while we do this. And once we've learned the nigun, we'll all sing it together. So without further ado, Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, please share with us what nigun you're going to teach us today and a little background about that nigun.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shani and Jackson. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. I see a lot of smiling faces. Some I'm not totally familiar with, some I'm very familiar with. I'm not gonna give shout outs, but assume that you've got your shout out. So it's so great having you all there. This is a nigun of Moshe Leib of Sasa. He's known as a person who devoted his entire life to helping people in trouble. Something of the persona of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, but a little different in some ways. He has this passionate love for the world, for people, as in particular, certainly for his fellow Jews who were persecuted and in trouble. He's famous for Pidyon Shivuyim, for ransoming hostages, that is to say, people who were falsely accused of crimes, often typically because they were Jewish and for no other reason, languishing in debtor's prison or in just on death row. And he found a way to raise the funds to get them out of prison. So this is a nigun that goes along with a story. I want to say something about that briefly, which is that I love Hasidic stories and I love Hasidic nigunim, but they're usually treated as separate genres. Recently, I developed a particular interest in this subcategory, which is fairly small, where the story has a nigun within the story. That is to say, the story mentions a nigun as part of the story. And even rarer, even more unusual, is if the story comes with an oral masorah, with an oral tradition where the person telling the story is actually able to sing the nigun referenced in the story as part of the story. So this is a pretty rare genre, and that's why I particularly love this nigun and this story. And it's also relevant to us today because much of his work has to do with, almost all of his work has to do with people in trouble. There's one story, as I was preparing, I was looking at, if you're not familiar with this, Buber's Tales of the Hasidim, there's a wonderful chapter on Reb Moshe Leib of Sasav. By the way, he was a disciple of Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg, so fourth generation in Hasidut. And I'm looking at Buber's Hebrew as well. So many of the stories, or some of the stories, refer to time of suffering, time of persecution, but also time of plague, interestingly enough. This is not the story that I'm about to give. Shani, don't lose hope. I'm going to get to the story, all right? And to the nigun.
I believe in you, Nehemiah.
But thank you. But I wanted to share this story as just background. This is from Buber. The rabbi of Sasav used to visit all the sick children in the town, sit at their bedside and nurse and take care of them. Once he said, someone who is not willing to suck the pus from the sore of a child sick with the plague has not climbed even halfway up the mountain to the love of his fellow human being. Whoa, that's a challenge. I think we'd have some questions about the social distancing, but the sentiment is very, very clear. So I wanted to give that as background. So now I'm finally coming to the story and to the niggin, if you're still with me. All right. So the story is called The Wedding Tune, and I'm going to look at Buber's Hebrew, which is based on, of course, early Hasidic publications, because the Hebrew is so rich. It says, one time there was an orphan boy and an orphan girl, and they met, they fell in love, they wanted to get married, but there's no money. So Rav Moshe Leib of Sasov heard about it, and he said, I'll take care of everything. He paid for the caterer, he paid for the chuppah, he paid for the klezmer, for the what we would call the band. He paid for everything. He even made sure that she had a dowry, and he was set up in a little business, and they were on their way. So on the day of the wedding, they were so overjoyed, of course, and so grateful, but no one beamed more than Moshe Leib of Sasov. Now I'm just going to read a little bit of the Hebrew. It says, "Kisheparsu et hachupa al rosh hachatan v'kala naharu panav shel harabi beziv ha'elyon." His face was beaming with a supernal radiance, because at that moment he had become a father twice over. So the wedding was beautiful, the klezmer played, and at one point they played a nigun that he had never heard before, and he was captivated by the nigun. And here's the nigun, or at least, now parenthetically, in my Hebrew college academic hat, there's a voice inside of me that says, oh, Nehemiah, you can't claim historicity for this nigun. There were no musicologists in those days. They did not notate it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not doing that now, right? We're doing Hasidic tradition, which is oral, and which does not particularly concern itself with those sort of scrupulous particularities of nailing things down with historicity. This is the way it has come down by tradition. So I'll do my best to channel this nigun.
And Nehemiah is going to sing its entire first part of the story, and then he's going to break it down. Now, Shani, the story's not over.
So I'm gonna complete the story, and then we can do the rest of it. So he was captivated by this niggin, and he turned to the klezmer and he said, "Where did you ever get that niggin from?" And I don't know what they answered, but he said, "You know, that niggin is so profound that I would love it. I would just love it if somehow on the day of my death, on the day of my passing, that they would play somehow or other, that niggin could be played at my funeral." That was it. And they had the Sheva Brachas, they had the dancing, the singing, no photographers in those days. It was great. It was great. And years passed, decades passed. I don't know how many decades, but it sounds from the story like it was a number of decades. Everybody forgot the whole episode. One day, in the middle of the winter time, this is, of course, a rough Polish winter, a group of musicians, a klezmer band, was called to play what we would call an upscale aristocratic wedding. So they were very, very excited of getting a serious gig. I mean, this could set them going forward for the next month at least. So they were practicing, they were preparing, they had a carriage, they were going to the wedding. Suddenly, the horses began to bolt. The horses that had been very subdued and stayed and doing what they should be doing suddenly went off the road, went into a field, went into a meadow. The driver tried to hold the reins and tried to get the horses back. There was no way that he could possibly do it. They seemed to know where they were going. They finally arrived at a large field, turned out to be a cemetery, and there was a funeral going on. The musicians suddenly had a thought. They said, "Who's being buried?" The answer came back, a great Hasidic master, Reb Moshe Leib of Sasov. They remembered the story that had happened decades back, and they said, "We know it's unusual. You don't want klezmer music, or at least it wasn't the custom in those days at all. But could we play a niggin that the rabbi specifically requested decades before to be played at his funeral?" They consulted with their rabbinic authorities, and the answer came back, yes, you can do it. And so they played do 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 da 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 da. Oh, 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 oh. Okay, Shani, if you want to go ahead.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank
All right,
you.
so we're gonna break this down. Everyone ready? Give a thumbs up. So as a reminder, for those who joined a little later, I'm going to be the voice of the learner. So everyone should be on mute if you feel comfortable, and you can show me your faces so I feel like people are singing with me and can see the sensation of you singing. That's ideal for me. And we'll break this down, learn it phrase by phrase, and then sing it through a bunch of times together. Nehemiah, you ready?
Yes.
Great. So go ahead and teach me the first short phrase.
Da, 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 da. Oh, 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 oh.
Okay, let me try that. Hi, 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 hi. Good? All right, let's do the next one.
Now, da, 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 oh, 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 oh.
I just want to do that last piece for myself because there's a little bit of a twist. Oh, right? It like kind of, it's a little sharp. I didn't quite get that twist, the second part, right?
I think that's good. That's good.
Variations are okay in the Hasidic tradition, Nehemiah?
Yes, I think so. That's a wonderful point. I always aim for fidelity and precision, but it's also true that variations are part of the genre. So it's good. It's totally good.
So all your variations that you're singing with us are totally good. You heard it from Nehemiah Poland. All right, next phrase, Nehemiah.
So this is really part two. So that is to say, what we've done so far is part one, and there's an A and a B to part one. A B clearly is a resolution, is a cadence to part one. And now this is part two. And full disclosure, well, not full disclosure, but disclosure, I'm no musician, and sadly, I really regret that I have no formal musical training. So this is just a lay person's impression, but this is unusual. Usually part B of a nigun, the second part, and or if there's a third part, goes higher. The register is higher, goes higher in the scale. This seems to me to go lower, actually, which means
Better
that
for me.
What's that? It's fine for you.
It's better for me.
It's better for you. But it has a kind of a gravitas, which maybe is part of what the nigun is trying to convey. So, those who have greater musical knowledge than I do can, I'm sure, fill this in. But here's how part B goes.
All right, I'm going to need that in even smaller chunks. I don't remember the next note.
So let's do that again. And now the resolution of part B. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die.
So do for me the first half of that last resolution.
Yeah. I'm going to have to run through the whole thing because I don't read notes, and it's just internal memory. So forgive me. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Yeah, da, 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 is out and
I'm going to start from the beginning of the last part. Yeah, is that how it goes?
Die, 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 die.
Die, 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 die. Yeah, die, die, die. Yeah, die, die, die.
Die, 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 die.
Okay, I'm gonna try it. Yeah, yeah, die, 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 yeah, die, die, die. That it? So do that whole first half until that moment.
Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die.
Okay, now my turn. Do I hear Lori with you?
Yes.
Hi, Lori. All right, my turn to try it. Yeah, die, 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 The last part I did a little
It was
twist.
very close, and it probably sounds better than the way I do it, but
Do it again your way. Yeah, die, 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 die. All right, now do the next part. Yeah, die, 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 die. All right, next part.
So that's it. It's just two parts, and that goes back to the beginning. So
I think what we'll do, because we're almost at our at 1:30, is why don't you go ahead, Nehemiah and Lori, and sing the whole thing through for us, and all of us on mute will sing with you.
beautiful. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Die, 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 die. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Die, 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 die.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, and guest star appearance by Lori.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shani, Jackson, and everyone who joined. What a wonderful niggun to share. What a wonderful story. And may the merit of our righteous tzaddikim and all the people who've shown us the way inspire us to do acts of kindness and compassion and open-heartedness in the sweetest and most benevolent way. Every blessing.
Amen, amen, amen. Thank you so much, Nehemiah. That concludes our time. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chodesh tomorrow.
Chodesh, right.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov.